everyone. Welcome back to Edubbey Dynamic Solution. Today we'll be treating paper 1, that is short answer and data responses on May-June 2023 Cambridge assessment, that is their past year question on business study. Of course, this paper 1 is supposed to be an objective question, but for business study here, we only have the short answer and data response, and we have to answer all the question in this section. Now let us move to the question directly here. We have question 1. We have a little summary here. Let us read that out. WLT manufactures carpets. That is the name of a company. It exports 40% of its products. Globalization has created opportunities and threats for WLT. Its methods of production allow WLT to use specialization. All of its 60 employees understand that quality assurance is important. WLT's directors are considering the best way to increase efficiency. Now let us go to the question here. We have question A. We are told to define specialization. What do you understand by specialization? Of course, it can be defined as when people or business concentrate on what they are best at. That is just a simple definition for specialization. Let us try to put the text here, or you can also define it as focusing an individual or focusing an individual or group of individual rather, or group of individuals or group on a particular skills. Of course, you can also define it as this. After all, you can put when the business concentrate on what they are best at, or the way in which work is divided so each worker can concentrate on a particular skills. Now we move to question 1B. Question 1B says we should identify method of production. Of course, there are just 3 methods of production. We have job, batch, and flow or mass production. Now let us just identify the 2 that was required according to the question. We have, as I mentioned, we have job production. Let's drag around here for the method 1. And we also have batch production. And the third one, as I said earlier, it is known as flow production. Now, moving to the question C. They said we should outline 2 advantages to WLT company of using quality assurance. Why do you think WLT company will use quality assurance in producing their carpet? The first advantage is to reduce default or errors in all stages of production. Let us try to write this out for proper understanding and when answering the question. To reduce fault at all stages of production. which leads to fewer mistakes, which leads to fewer mistakes when making the carpet. Of course, the carpet is the application of the summary given to us. Let's reduce this to look more beautiful. Now, to reduce faults at all costs, to reduce faults at all the stages of production. Of course, we also have another advantages. We have fewer customer complaint and fewer customers. Let us try to put it here. Now, the second advantages of using quality assurance by WLT is to have fewer customer to have fewer customer complaint customer complaints. Yes, that is also one of the advantages of him using the quality assurance. Of course, that is not all for the advantages of using it. We also have the better brand image, that is to improve their reputation, and to reduce inspection cost, that is they do not need to hire inspector when they are checking the products at all stages. Now let us move to the next question here. We have question 1. Let us see. We have question 1D. Explain one opportunity and one threat of globalization for WLT. Now, what do you think can be an opportunity to WLT? Of course, they will have an increase in their sales. Let us just try to put this point out. Let's try to put the point out here. They will have what I said, increase in sales, increase in sales. And let us put the explanation of how the increase in sales can be an opportunity to WLT. Accessing more market as it exports 40% according to the application of its products will increase the revenue. Now let's try to drag this. Let's try to drag it. Exports. And the product will increase the revenue. Now, that is not the only opportunity for the company. We have cheaper raw materials from other countries. We also have the labor that might be cheaper and the global brand that are more recognized and desirable. But we were told to just list one opportunity and give an explanation. Now, moving to the threat of globalization to WLT company. We have one of the threats to be an increased competition, that is an increase in competition. Now, how does this increase serve as a threat? Of course, it will lead to a reduction. Let's type it out under our explanations. Space. under our explanation space here, it will lead to a reduction in the market share. It will lead to a reduction in the market share, to lead to a reduction in the market share when they are facing an increase in the competition. And we also have other threat also. Employees may leave if WLT cannot pay as much the international competitor are doing. And there might also be over dependent on supplies from other country. Now we move to the 1E, where we have the questions. Do you think improving labor skill is the best way for a manufacturer doing business to increase efficiency? You have to justify your answer. First, here you have to bring out some points of improving labor skill before you can justify your answer. First one here is being able to work faster, that is able to work faster. That is the way of improving labor skill, able to work faster, that will increase the output per worker, that will increase the output per worker, that will increase the output per worker. Do you think if improving labor skill is the best way for a manufacturing business to increase efficiency? You have to justify your answer here. But before you go to your justification, you have to give points of improving labor skill and what can improving in labor skill can give. The first point here is being able to work faster. Let us bring out the test. Let's bring out the test. Able to work faster, which will do what? It will increase, which will increase the output per workers. Of course, when improving labor skill, the work will be faster and the production per worker will also increase. Let's reduce this to contain more points. Now we have when improving labor skill, of course, fewer mistakes will be made, which can also lead to less wastage or less reward. Now let us bring out the point also. Let's bring out the point. Fewer mistakes will be what? Will be fewer mistakes are made. Fewer mistakes are made, which can lead to wastage, less wastage rather, can lead to less wastage or reward. Let's reduce this also for more points. Of course, it can also cause an increase in training cost. Of course, by improving labor skill, it will cause an increase in training cost, which can actually lead to an increase in unit cost. Now let's try to bring the point out. An increased training cost. Increased training cost. that can lead to an increase in unit cost of product. Increased training cost, that is why improving labor skills, which will increase, which will also increase the unit cost, also increase the unit cost of the product. And the product is what? We are dealing with carpet. Now let us reduce this also. Now, other ways might also include the automation or machinery that can allow operation with fewer employees. Now, to justify your answer here, of course, you have to tell the examiner you really know what you are doing. Now, let us bring out the justification. To justify, in order to justify your answer. Now, as we said earlier, we are just bringing out the point, but when you are justifying, you will also bring some points listed above into your justification. You can say improving labor skills can mean what? Can mean that employees makes fewer mistakes. Of course, we have mentioned this above, and it can also lead to less reward. As I said, yes, it leads to fewer mistakes. All these are British English here. Improving labor skills can mean that employees make fewer mistakes. Of course, when I said an automation can also allow the business to operate with fewer employees. Yes. Now, what is your conclusion here? Improving labor skill is the best way because automation could lead to redundancy, which may demotivate the remaining employees. Now let us move to the next. Now let us move to the next question here. Let us move to the next question. That is question 2A. That is question 2A. Question 2A, where we have the LMA company. LMA is a family-owned restaurant. The business was started 20 years ago and has remained small. LMA is a partnership. The partners are considering whether LMA should become a private limited company. The finance manager is analyzing LMA's cash flow forecast. An extract is shown in table 2.1, that is the table we are seeing below this table, the extract from LMA's cash flow forecast for 2023 in $1,000. Now let us look at the question underneath. Question 2A, we were asked to identify reasons why business might have cash flow problems. Why do you think a business can have cash flow problems? Of course, the first reason is too much inventory. Let's try to type this out. We're told to identify when there is too much inventory, of course, a business might have a cash flow problems. And it can, why another reason here is poor financial planning. Let's try to bring that out also. Poor financial planning or poor planning. Anyone you put it, you have your 1 mark. Poor financial planning. Now, these are not the only two reasons why a business might actually have cash flow. It can be due to growing too quickly or over trading, or having trade receivable too long to pay. Now let us look at the 2B question here. We have to calculate x and y. Now let us go back to the table. Our x here, we were told to find the net cash flow for July, and the y, we were told to find the closing balance for September. Now to calculate our net cash flow, we actually know the formula for our net cash flow is our cash inflow minus our cash outflow. Now let us solve for x. To solve for x now, we should have the 420 as our cash inflow and the cash outflow as 410. Though we're not told to show our workings here, we just have to subtract it, and the 420 minus 410 will actually give us what? 10 as our net cash flow. Of course, the naira dollar sign is here already, and if you wish to put it, you can actually add it to your own answer. You can put it as $10,000, or you write it as ordinary 10. And to calculate our y here, that is for our closing balance, it should be net cash flow plus opening balance. That is the formula for calculating our closing balance. Now we have the net cash flow of September to be -30, and the opening balance is 50. Now the -30 with the opening balance, our closing balance will be $20,000 or 20. Let us write this out also. To be $20,000 rather. That is $20,000, or you can write it as 20. That's all. Now we move to question 2C. Identify 4 examples of cash inflow. Now, what do you understand by cash inflow? Say, we have to identify 4 examples of cash inflow. That is when money is coming in and the way money can come into a business. Of course, the first one is sales or revenue. That is cash sales or revenue. Cash what? Cash sales or revenue. What other way do you know as an example of cash inflow? We also have bank loan. We also have bank loan. Of course, a bank loan can also serve as a cash inflow. When you borrow money and use for your business, it is also a cash inflow to you. Also, we also have sales of non-current assets. Now let's drag to the example 3. Example 3, we have sales of non-current assets, also known as fixed asset. Of course, when selling an asset, the cash derived from it is also a cash inflow to you. Now, moving to example 4, it can also be a payment from trade receivables. Of course, payment from debtors can also be a cash inflow to the business. Payment from trade receivables. Yes, trade receivable. That is the debtors. When you collect money from your debtors, it will actually become a cash inflow to your business. Now we move to the next question here. We have 2D. Explain one advantage and one disadvantage to LMA of becoming a private limited company. Of course, we were told that LMA was given an advice to become a private limited company, according to the summary we read. Now, what are the advantages that you think can be of benefit to LMA when becoming the private limited company? Of course, it will have a limited liability. Let us put the text here. An advantage, one of the advantages is what? Having limited liabilities. Having limited liability. Of course, let us give the little explanation here on the limited liability. Let us put the explanation here on the limited liability. His asset will not be at risk. Its assets will not be at risk if the business is not able to pay what? To pay its debt. That is one of the advantages of becoming a private limited company to LMAW. Of course, we are told to just explain one here, but there are many advantages. We have separate legal identity, able to raise finance by selling share, and also the continuity. Now let us choose one disadvantages. Also, disadvantages of becoming a private limited company to LMA company. Changing to private limited company might actually be time consuming. That is one of the disadvantages of changing to private limited company is time consumption. That's time consuming. Yes, it is time consuming for the business when trying to move to private limited company. And let us give a little explanation here for us to get our mark. Of course, it will be expensive. It is expensive or time consuming to change to this form of business organization. Yes, time consuming for the business organization. Now let us drag here before we move to the next question. Now, that is not what we need. Now, we move to question 2E. Explain 2 reasons why business might remain small and which reason is likely to be most important. You have to justify your answer. Why do you think business might remain small? The first point is lack of finance. Now let us treat lack of finance. Of course, when the access to capital is more difficult, it can also make a business to remain small. Of course, it makes, let's give an explanation, it makes it difficult to fund what? To fund the expansion. To fund the expansion. To fund the expansion or the working capital. Or the working capital. Let's try to reduce this for other points. That's the first reasons why a business might remain small. Now, the second reasons is lack of skill or knowledge to expand larger business. Let's try to put it out. Lack of knowledge. Just put it lack of knowledge or skills. Lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge. Now, to give just short an explanation further, larger businesses are more what? Larger businesses are more, just let us use businesses. Larger businesses are more difficult to manage. They are more difficult to manage and likely to make mistake, and likely to make a mistakes if they expand. Of course, when there is no knowledge of the business, it might actually lead to difficulty in managing and also allow mistakes when expanding the business. We're told to just give two reasons. Of course, we have a lot of reasons here also before we move to our justification. We have lack of workers also, and it also depends on the personal owner's objective most of the time. And also we have the type of industry, service, or more. Now let's move to the justification of our two reasons we just mentioned above. The two reasons we just mentioned above. Let us add text and let's see what can be in our justification in order to attain our full mark. As we listed above, we have the reason for their expansion to be the lack of finance, and there is also size of the market when considering the business remain small. Let us just put the justification as based on the size of the market. Of course, a company remains small actually depend on the size of the market, because when there is no customer, there is no revenue. Let us write the size of the market is more important reasons. It's a more important reason why a business might remain small. Yes, might remain small. As I explained, of course, when there is When the size of the market is relatively small, there might not be revenue, as there might not be enough revenue. And this can actually reduce the need for finance anyway. Now let's reduce this. Let's try to reduce this. Now, let's move to the next question here. Let's move to the next question. Let's zoom this. Now we move to question 3. Question 3 says DZD, that's the name of their choice. Now let us see what is in there. DZC is a large parcel delivery business. Many of its employees work part-time. DZD's directors are planning to expand the business and have to decide on a suitable source of finance for 20 new vehicles. DZD will also recruit 60 new employees. The Human Resources Director is preparing a job description for the new employees. She is considering using Maslow hierarchy of needs to increase the motivation of DZD's employees. Now to the question under it. 3A says we should define job description. What do you understand by job description? Of course, it is simply defined as, let us bring out the text. It is defined as a list, let's try the right way. It is defined as a list of the key points, about a job. The job title, the duty, job title, the duties, responsibilities, and the accountability. That is just simple explanation for job description. Let us reduce this job description. Now, job description can also be defined as the outline the responsibility and duty to be carried out by someone employed in order to do the specific job. Now let us move to the next question, that is 3B. We have to identify 2 levels from Maslow hierarchies of needs. I know we know what Maslow hierarchy of needs is, and it contains 5 needs. Now we were just told to mention 2 here. Of course, the first one is physiological or physical need, that is psychological need. That's our psychological need. Let's write it out. Psychological needs. Now let us try to drag it to the first space. Now the second one is safety or security needs. Safety or security needs. Safety or security need. Other needs are social belonging needs, self-esteem, and self-actualization. Now let's move to 3C. In 3C, we are told to outline 2 factors DZD should consider when deciding which applicant to recruit. Of course, there are more than 2. but we just have to identify two. When recruiting an employee, this LD should consider the experience of the delivering party, that is what they are dealing with, their business experience in what? Experience of delivering parcel. Don't forget, this is an application of the summary given to us in the question. Yes, yes. Experience in delivering parcel. And the second thing to consider when recruiting is also the qualification or relevant example, whether they have driving license to drive the 20 vehicle they are about to introduce. Let us try to put the text, and you make sure you put the application of the summary in order for you to get your full mark. Qualification, short as having driving license, having driving license to drive the 20 vehicles, to drive the to drive the 20 vehicles. Now, since we have mentioned the two factors that this ZG might considered in order to, when recruiting rather, there are also more factors to consider. We have the skill, such as good communication too, their performance during the interview, their age, and the references. Now let us move to the next question. We have 3D. Explain two sources of finance this ZZ might use for the new vehicle that they are about to introduce. Of course, the first one is bank loan. Let us try to put the text. Bank loan. And how does this helpful in purchasing the new vehicle? Of course, it helps to purchase immediately, as there will be no delay to the planned expansion when the bank loan is received at once. Let's try to put the explanation. It helps to purchase immediately. To purchase immediately. Since bank loan is received at once. Now let us try to fit this in, and this should start with capital letter. Yes. Now another source that can be used while purchasing the new vehicle is the retained profit. Retained profit is also one of the source this ZZ can actually use for the new vehicle introduction. Now let's try to put this out. Retained profit, retained profit, retained profit. And the explanation might be, let us put the text. The explanation might be the explanation here based on retained profit. Let's drag it here. This might be useful because as a large business, there is no need to repay the retained profit since if the company own the profit, there is no need for repayment as it is a large business. Yes, there is no need for repayment. Of course, there are other ways to use apart from these two we were told to mentioned. We have hire purchases, also we have selling of assets, and we also have owners capital and share issues. Now let us move to the next question here. We have 3E. In 3E, do you think a service business should only employ a part-time workers? And you have to justify your answer. Of course, we have to give a point on part-time and gives a point on full-time also in order to give our valid justification of whether the business should only employ part-time workers or full-time workers. Now let's try to add our test. Let's go with the part-time first. Let's go with the part-time worker first. We have part-time workers. You have the part-time workers. What now? The part-time worker. Of course, that for the business, there is no need to pay workers to the part-time when they are not working. Let us just let's try to put this out. No need to pay wages. No need to pay wages. Why not working? Of course, they won't pay. Yes, I need to recruit trained employee, which can take more time also. It can allow now to the business now. We move to the business now. We are just relating this to the business. So it could also allow the business, it could also allow the business to recruit wider range of skills, employees. Now let us just reduce this for another point. Yes, it could allow the business to recruit wider range of skills. Let's try to drag up. Okay, that is for part-time worker. It can also be due to more flexible hours also and easier to extend worker hours as they are busy time. Now let us move to the full-time workers and see some little points there also. Let's try to see the points for the full-time and choose whether the business should continue to employ only part-time worker to the business. Full-time workers. What are their factors? Now to start with, of course, they will be able to offer consistency service. Let us try to write that out. Offering consistency what? Consistency service that could improve that could improve the what? That could improve the reputation of the business of the business. That is one point. Of course, it can give rooms for easier communication. It also gives room for easier communication when the company is making use of a full-time worker. Let's try to fix this. And yes, it can also lead to less workers needed too. Now, to justify this answer whether a service sector business should have the part-time worker. Of course, the service sector, especially when related to service sector. Let us try to put the text out here. We move to the justification. When you are justifying your answer, you must let them know what, if you really understand the question. A service sector business. Let us try to continue our test. A service sector business should not have only part-time worker. Why do you think so? Because quality is vital for customer. Because, let us try to write it out. Because quality is vital for customers' loyalty, which can also affect the sales. It can also affect the sales. Let's try to reduce this in order to fit in this space. Now, can give more as you want due to this justification in order to get your full mark. Now, let us move to the next question we have here. Let's move to the next question. I think we have question 4 here. We have question 4. Now, let's read out this summary first. NLR, as the name implies, manufactures a range of branded skincare products, including hand cream. Packing of the product is important. Like many businesses, NLR makes use of market segmentation. The marketing director knows the stages of product life cycle, can influence NLR's pricing decision, is analyzing market research data. This shows 85% of consumers expect businesses to respond to environmental failures. Now, what is the question underneath here? We have the 4A. Identify 2 factors that might affect the accuracy of market research. Of course, there are a lot of factors that might actually affect the market research accuracy. But the first one I'm giving here is the sample choosing. Of course, sample choosing, or the person that is being asked about a particular product cannot be the representative, cannot be an accurate representative. And also an interviewer experience. That's the second factors I would like to talk about here. The interviewer choosing. Of course, the interviewer choosing or the interviewer bias. When asking people some question, most of the time, they might actually not want to expose what the answer really is, or they will be hiding some of the answer appropriately. We still have more factors such as the person that carry out the research and the sample size also. Now let us move to the question 4B, and then identify the two benefits to the business of using market segmentation. Why do you think the company makes use of market segmentation? The first point here is it helps them to focus spending and make best use of the resources. Now let's try to put that out. It helps in making what? Just let's try using the application. It helps the business in best making best use of their resources making the best use of their resources. Let's try to reduce this for the second point. Another point here is being able to tailor goods to specific need of the relative segment. That is, when to know what the produce. Now let's try to put the text in the second benefit. The second benefit. It also helps to know the specific needs, to know the specific needs of the segment or what to produce. Of course, that is not all the benefit of the market segmentation to a business. It can also be to identify the gaps in the market and to help them to decide the best place to sell. Now we are told, moving to the next question here, we have question 4C. We are told to outline two ways NLR might respond to environmental failure. What way do you think can be used to respond to environmental failure? Now let's go to the way one. Way one can actually be by reducing the amount of materials used. Let's try to put the text and make sure you apply the summary given to you at the beginning of this question. By reducing the amount of material used, or let's say wastage. When making their skincare product. This skincare product is an application. Hope you remember. Now let's try to drag to fit this in. Now that's the first way. Now the second way can also be using recycled material for the packaging. Using recycled material, that is the material that can be reused by using what? By using recycled. Let's try to type. By using recycled materials that can be reused. So it can also be another way. Materials for the packaging, from the packaging, recycled material for the packaging. Of course, it can also be one of the way to respond the environmental failure. Of course, there are more, but we are told to just outline the two. It can also be by reducing transport use, ask customers to reuse their containers when buying their goods. Also, now we move to the next question here. We move to question 4D. Explain how NLR's pricing decision might be affecting two different stages of product life cycle. Of course, product life cycle, as we have introductory stage, we have growth, we have maturity, but we are just told to mention two different stages of our choice. Here, now let us put the first one as the introductory stages. The introductory stage, and we have to give the explanation how these stages could affect NLR's pricing decision. Let us drag the text here before we can give our explanation. Yes, the business may need to, let's say, they might need to set a low price. Of course, at the introductory stages, they might need to set a low price to attract customers, to their and cream. We are still making the application of the summary given to us. Yes, that is one of the stages. Now let us choose another stages apart from the one I just mentioned earlier. We also have the maturity stage. We also have the maturity stage. We have the maturity stage. Let's try to write. No, it's supposed to be here. Okay. Maturity stage. Now, how does this stage affect their pricing decision? Of course, the price is likely to be similar to the competitor's own. Let's try to put the text to explain here. The price is likely to be similar to the competitor's own. To retain the market share for the product. Now, that is also a brief explanation of how maturity stage can also affect the price. And we also have the decline stages, where the discount might be offered to maintain sales. Now, let's move to the next question here. We move to question 4E. Do you think promoting the brand image is the most important role of packaging? Justify your answer. Why do you think promoting brand image is the most important role of packaging? Now let's try to put out some points that might actually be acceptable by the examiner. The first point here is packaging might attract customer. Let's try packaging might attract customers against competitor against competitors competitors products against competitors products. And this can also help to increase sales, which can also lead to higher revenue. Let's try to reduce this. Another point is packaging provide information about the product. Let's try to add the text also for better explanation. It also provides information about the product Now you can also refer to the hand cream here. Let's reduce the size. Also, you can pick any of these points why you want to justify your answer. There might also be a legal requirement, as the business might have to identify the ingredient. Now, the justification might include packaging that help the product stand out against the competitor, as we have listed, that can increase the sales. Let's try to write that out. The justification. The justification to what we are listed. Of course, there are more to it. Just let us put the justification as this. Packaging helps the product to stand out against competitors. Products, which helps to increase the revenue. Yes, first point could be this, and here we are told to justify whether the brand image is the most important of role. Was is it perform an important role in packaging? Let's try to reduce this to continue our explanation. Therefore, brand image is not the most important. Of course, the customer might aware of the product to buy. It is important because damaged goods can be. Brand image might not be the most important role. Why? Because the customer needs to be aware of the product to buy. And also, the disadvantages here is that damaged goods will not be identified by the customer. Let us try and continue. Brand image might not be the most important role, because customer might need to be aware of the product to buy. Yes, they might need to be aware of the product they are buying. And this serves as an advantage for the company when doing the branding. They might also sell the damaged products, and the disadvantage to the customer buying it, as after being opened, it cannot be returned to the company. Let's see if we still have question here. I think we are done with this year paper 1 question. This brings us to the end of this paper 1 of May 2023 Cambridge assessment. To see more of our video, kindly subscribe, share, and like our video. See you in our next video. Bye.